So I have a book in my house that I borrowed from somebody from our church. They let us borrow it for a while so that our children could spend some time reading it. And this week I took some time to pick it up and flip through a little bit myself. It's kind of a fun book. It's called Weird Canadian Laws. And what I like about this book is that you get to read lots of laws that just don't seem to make sense. Some of them are kind of funny, others seem a little bit ridiculous. And there's one that I thought was interesting that I wanted to read for you this morning. Did you know that in Canada, it is illegal to stop a clergy person or a pastor from conducting a religious service? And if you do this, if you're found guilty of doing it, you could go to prison for up to 2 years. So if one of you jumped or tried to stop me right now, you could actually get yourselves into a lot of trouble. Another interesting law is that if you made up a story that wasn't true, and you told people that it was, that the story actually did happen, and then one of these people that you told took the time to write down your story and they put it in the newspaper, and then if people found out the story that you told wasn't true, then you could actually spend another 2 years in jail for making up a story. In 1928, the town of Pinoca made a law that said every house and every business had to have a garbage can to put their garbage in. And if they were found to not be using their garbage can to put their garbage in, that they could be fined $50 and they could be sentenced to spend 60 days in jail. There are also at least 2 cities in Canada that have laws saying that you can't use a wheelbarrow or a cart of any other kind to transport dirt down the sidewalk. And you can actually get a lot of trouble if you can try to bring dirt from one place to another using the sidewalk. And one of these 2 cities actually took the time to make a law about how to walk on the sidewalk. So you kind of have to follow the same rules as the road. So if you're going one way, somebody else is coming the other way, you have to pass them on the right. But if they're going the same direction, you have to pass them on the left. You can't go around them on the other side. There's actually a law about this. Now, I haven't read this whole book yet, but the laws that I've read in this book called Ridiculous or Strange Canadian Laws, most of them seem to be pretty ridiculous. Like, does it really matter what side of the sidewalk we walk on? As long as we don't crash into another person on the sidewalk, we should be allowed to walk where we want to, right? But then some of the other laws, they maybe make a little bit of sense. We shouldn't be making up stories and saying that they're true and having them go into the garbage can. And we should be using, have them go in the newspaper, and we should be using garbage cans instead of letting our garbage pile up in our backyard or somewhere else. So these laws actually do make sense, but I really wonder, do we really need a law about that? And is 60 days or 2 years in jail a fair punishment for breaking some of these laws? The truth is that most of these laws come from somewhere, that we have a reason for having them. For example, if I wasn't putting my garbage in a garbage can, then the garbage collectors would never be able to come and pick it up, and soon it'd be blowing out of my backyard and into my neighbor's backyard or across the road to the golf course or some other place. And I'm pretty sure that my neighbor doesn't want old newspapers or dirty tissues or other gross things blowing from my backyard into hers. And if we didn't have laws about speeding or about driving, about how we drive or who is allowed to drive, we'd have all sorts of bad drivers driving way too fast and crashing into each other all the time. So most of the laws that we have for a reason. And the reasons seem to be for people's safety or to show consideration to other people, to make sure that we're aware of how we affect other people. And these are important things. We want to be safe. We want to show consideration, and we want to show that we care for other people, right? Now, do you think laws help with that? Well, they kind of do, but they also don't. You can make a law about how fast somebody can drive or where to put your garbage. But if I really wanted to, I could start to annoy my neighbor with where I park my car or how loud I play my music. And then if you made laws about those things, and I still wanted to be annoying, I could find other ways of causing her or somebody else trouble, couldn't I? And then you'd have to make rules about those things, and I'd have to find other ways to be annoying instead. So laws don't really work because they try to change your behavior. They try to make you act in a certain way. And they try to make you do and to not do certain things in certain situations. But what they don't change is what's on the inside. They don't change your heart. If I wanted to be annoying, if I wanted to be a nuisance, I would find a way to do that no matter what laws we had in place. So for this year, your GEMS theme was to be a blessing. And I thought, what would it be like if we made that into a law? What if instead of having laws about garbage and speeding and everything else, if we had one law that said, be a blessing? The more I thought about it, I thought, well, it would be nice, but I don't think that would really work either. Because what you might think to be a blessing might be different from what your neighbor or from somebody else or what I think. One person might think to be a blessing would mean to be generous and to have to share what you have with those who have need. Well, another person might think that to be a blessing means to be respectful, to use kind words, to show kindness to others. Now, I happen to think that being a blessing includes both of those things. But if there's somebody who disagrees with me, it's really hard to decide who's right and who's wrong, isn't it? And so we can't have a law that says, be a blessing. But it is something that we do read about in the Bible. It is something that as gems that you learned about this year as you came here on Thursday nights. The GEMS theme verse for this year, from 2 Corinthians 9, verse 8. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things and in all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. Another way of saying this is, God can and God will bless you with all that you could ever need, so that you can be a blessing for others in everything that you do. Now, the Apostle Paul, when he wrote this, he really wanted to emphasize this word all. He wants you to know that in all that you do, you will have all that you need, so that you can be a blessing whenever you need it, in every time that you can. In 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, Paul talks about giving money. The church in Jerusalem was experiencing a famine, and they didn't have enough food to eat. They didn't have enough money to buy what they needed. So Paul was encouraging the Corinthian church to be generous with the money that they had so that the church in Jerusalem could get the food that they needed. But then he also reminds the Corinthian people that the church in Jerusalem had already been generous to them. The first Christians came from Jerusalem, and they traveled through Asia and through Greece and all the way to Rome so that others could hear about Jesus and so that they could believe in him too. And so they were being generous by preaching the gospel and by telling them about God's love for them. Other churches at that time were generous in other ways. And because they all wanted to be a blessing, each church and each community could have what they needed. They shared with each other and they shared with those in need. Now, we've talked about laws, and we can talk about rules, but I don't think that Paul meant for this to be a rule at all. He wasn't saying to the Corinthian people, I need you to be a blessing. I'm making a rule now that you have to be a blessing, and that you have to give money so that the church in Jerusalem will have what they need. No, he wasn't trying to make a rule at all. What Paul was trying to do was to help the Corinthian church to respond to what they had already received. The gift they were giving was a way of saying thank you for the gift they had been given. In 2 Corinthians 9, verse 15, Paul says, "Thanks be to God for his indescribable great gift." Right before that, in verse 14, he wrote about the surpassing grace that God had given them. And this grace, this gift, this indescribable gift they had received, is the same gift that he gives to us. Last week, we celebrated Easter here. And at Easter and on Good Friday, we remember that Jesus suffered and he died to pay the price for our sins. This was something that only he could do. And he did it willingly because he loves each one of you. And on the third day, on Easter Sunday, God raised Jesus from the dead so that we could have eternal life and that we could live with him someday. This is the indescribable gift. And this is the surpassing grace that God gives us. And if you believe this, then you are richer than the richest man or the richest woman in the whole world. A wise missionary once said, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." When I was young, my grandmother tried to teach me that it was important to always write a thank you card whenever somebody gives you a gift or when somebody does something for you. Now, I don't think I learned this lesson very well because I still don't very often write thank you cards, but sometimes I try to. But what Paul's trying to do is he's trying to teach the Corinthian people the same lesson that my grandmother was trying to teach me. The best way to say thank you to God for the grace that he has given us is to be generous or to be a blessing to others. Now, this is not a rule. It's not a law. It's a way of life. It's something that we get to do every day because of what God has done for us. Our giving, our being generous, and our being a blessing is a way of saying thank you to God for the ways that he has been generous to us. Now, I've heard that your counselors have worked very hard this year. One of the things that I've heard described a few times about them is, and that we've heard this morning already, is that they were all in. That they were all very excited to be part of the GEMS program, and they were committed to you as GEMS. And that they worked very hard so that you could have the year here that you did. So your counselors were very generous with their time and with their energy. And we as a church are very thankful for their commitment. Now others in this church saw this commitment of your counselors, and they were very generous in supporting the program by making sure that the counselors had enough money to buy the crafts and to do all the fun activities that you got to do this year. And because of these things, I think you as a GEMS group were also very generous as well. Now, I've often been here on a Thursday night, either for a meeting or even just to pick up my own girls from GEMS. And what I noticed when I was here on Thursday nights is that you as a GEMS group were very generous with your energy and with your excitement. I was very blessed by you when I would come into this church and just feel the energy that came from your GEMS group. And this morning, many of you were generous in using your gifts by leading us as you read scripture, or as you played piano, as you sang. And I believe that each one here, all of us, have been blessed by you this morning. And so I want to give thanks for each one of you girls for being a blessing in this church. I want to give thanks for each one of your counselors who is a blessing to each of you in the GEMS program. And I also want to give thanks for this church who supports this GEMS club so that each of you can learn how to be a blessing in this church and in this world. And I think together we also need to give thanks to God for the indescribable gift of grace that God gives to each one of us through Jesus Christ, his Son. And so I want to pray for each of you in this GEMS program that you may never, ever forget about this gift, and that you'll always be a blessing to those around you. Let us pray. Dear Father in heaven, I give thanks for this GEMS program. I give thanks for the girls and the young ladies that come faithfully to GEMS, Lord, to learn about you, to hear your word, and to hear how they can be a blessing to others because of the ways that they have been blessed by you. I give thanks too for the counselors, Lord, and for this church that wants to surround these young ladies with your love and with your care. And I pray that together that we may be a blessing to you and a blessing to others as we learn together about you and your grace. We ask this in your name.